I've found that getting overwhelmed or working too much is honestly not kind of the deciding factor for ambitious people. They don't mind going above and beyond as long as they're picking up new skills, do feel like they're doing it alongside people that they like and are working towards a larger goal. And so I tend to focus a lot of my effort on ensuring that people are working on meaningful things.
From Numeric, this is Incoming Statements, the podcast built for forward-thinking accounting pros. Join Anthony Alvernaz, Numeric's co-founder and chief product officer, as he talks with accounting leaders about what practices and philosophies are defining modern financial operations. So grab your coffee, throw on some headphones, and let's dive in.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Incoming Statements. I'm your host, Anthony Alvernaz from Numeric, and today I'm joined by Sruthi Lanka. Sruthi is the CFO at Public.com, and today we'll be very excited to spend some time talking through her journey, somewhat of an unconventional one, pivoting from a software engineer through the financial crisis to a finance professional who now champions the importance of data warehousing in finance and accounting. Sruthi, thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm so happy to be on. Thank you, Anthony, for having me on Incoming Statements. I look forward to the conversation.
All right. Well, Sruthi, excited to be here today, and why don't we jump right in? Would love to start with just a super open-ended question and get a sense for the folks listening. What's your story? What makes you who you are? What do you do today? Kind of tell us everything you'd like to share.
Yeah. I serve as CFO of Public.com. Public is an investment platform where you can trade a broad swath of assets. So you can trade everything from stocks and ETFs to scores, also crypto and bonds. You can trade corporate bonds or treasuries on our platform and invest in high yield cash products. In addition to a full suite of assets, we offer best in class investing tools. So one that's particularly interesting, I think, for me is called Alpha. It's an AI-based chat assistant. It pulls from proprietary data model and a crazy number of public finance data points to help inform investing decisions. It's like a little assistant in your pocket. At Public, I oversee finance, but also data. I think that's a little bit unique, but I've talked about this a little bit. And I really see the marriage of those two functions as central to most finance teams in the future. And this means that really we don't rely on our financial statements to drive most information or decision making in the business. We capture a lot of that information in our data warehouse, and the two teams work very closely to ensure that the two information sets are consistent. In prior lives, I worked at another then startup called Moneyline, which now became a public company and then went private again, and several years on Wall Street. I started out as an engineer, which may be a little bit of a fun fact, and no one should let me near any code now, but I think it was a useful, grounding for a career in startups.
Absolutely. Amazing. Well, appreciate the rundown, and definitely a lot we're excited to dig into today. In particular, I think we share the philosophy of data-driven accounting and making decisions based on a completely comprehensive financial data warehouse really being the only way to operate in the future. And so we'll love to dig in a little bit more on how you've approached that at Public and what some of the learnings have been as you've staffed folks to actually build that out. But you've sort of described yourself in the past, I've heard, as an accidental CFO, and you mentioned just now transitioning from engineer to CFO. We've always thought of accountants to be very systematic thinkers in many ways, engineers at heart, and that makes our team very happy, of course, when we're, from a product development standpoint, working with folks to help define what we're building and how and why we're building it. But I'm curious, was there ever a moment early on when you questioned that shift, or was it really just curiosity that sparked the transition? What led you to make the move into more of an operational role on the sort of business side and finance side?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you asked me even like 10 years ago, or certainly at the start of my career, there's no way I would have predicted this outcome. So I do think it was curiosity that led me down this path. But I think it was honestly just timing. Like so many things in life, it's really just luck and timing, right? I graduated into the 2008-9 financial crisis. Possibly a lot of listeners of your podcast avoided it entirely, which is great for them. But Honestly, it was like a seismic time, a tectonic time, really, in financial services, right? And I joined Goldman Sachs at the time as an engineer, and I really didn't fully understand what was going down around me, but I just couldn't believe that so many smart people got this so wrong. So it was really like trying to understand how such large systemic risk could even come about. That it led to a bunch of questions and more questions, and then some education, because that's always helpful as you answer these questions. And so that's kind of what led me down the path of finance. But to your point, I actually see finance and engineering as extremely similar in many ways. Of course, there's a strong math basis, but also there's a real kind of systems thinking. You're trying to put frameworks and structures around what may originally seem like not quantitative decisions, right? So the ability to really put numerical frameworks around decisions that drive the business is what makes finance interesting. And really, if you think about it, engineers are doing that in the real world in many ways. So I see a lot of parallels in the skill set. And I do think that system based approach has served me well as I've gone down this path.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Do you feel like there's some fundamentally different way that you think about solving problems that background has sort of ingrained in you?
I do think it's useful to think about things from first principles perspective. In many ways, I think I'm advantaged by a lack of knowledge because I didn't grow up around, ERPs or the NetSuites of the world or the accounting systems of the world. A lot of my approach really to accounting and financial statements is based on, thinking about it fundamentally from the point of view of the business. And so the advantage of that is I feel like I'm not hamstrung by what the systems of today can do. And I'm lucky to find partners like yourselves who think the same way, right? So companies that are rethinking the way the traditional equations of finance and accounting are represented in the systems of today, right? So I think it really allows me to step back a little bit and think about the concepts and then implement it maybe differently than other companies. One example of that, I would say, is a lot of our close processes actually live outside of our accounting system. And one of the things that we're trying to move towards is really a daily close process within the company. And I think for most companies, we're lucky to be a technology company where we don't have really hard goods. We don't have inventory. We're not dealing with, supply chain disruptions, things like that. And so it's actually possible to capture every single detail of this business on a daily basis without much difficulty, but there's no accounting system that's built for this today, right? And so starting from what we want to achieve, which is understanding accurately the financial picture of this business daily, is a good starting place. And I think a first principles view, and then figuring out how to actually do it, that comes next.
Certainly, certainly. So if you're defining your kind of ideal accounting system, let's imagine you're rebuilding or rethinking what it means to operate an ERP or to be a general ledger. What are some of the fundamentals that you would change to really orient more around daily closes or more of a daily cadence to a lot of accounting operations? What would be true in such a system?
I mean, in reality, we just need to capture the information that lives kind of rent free in all of the employees' heads, right? Like if I think about this business, right, our marketing team knows exactly how much they're spending every day, how much they want to spend, how they're thinking about the opportunity, the trade-offs in the market every day, right? We just need a system that allows them to capture that and a finance person to double check, make sure that things are like looking directionally correct. We don't, there's no, obviously there's no fraudulent behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Like you have all the checks and balances that come around it. Equally, really, if you look at more like a personnel footprint, again, we're a tech business. We're not super dependent on ongoing personnel hiring. We don't, our head count is pretty static for the most part. Certainly we hire engineers, we hire some people occasionally, but it doesn't change that much. So it's really easy for me to understand. And between marketing and personnel, those are the two biggest expense line items for really pretty much any software company out there, right? And so if you think about it, most of the expenses within the company are extremely knowable. And because we're a consumer company, it's true on a revenue and gross profit perspective as well. So what we do is we accrue all of these on a daily basis, but it lives in Google Sheets, not in any accounting system, right? There's no way. Think about the amount of noise this would create in NetSuite or QuickBooks or whatever, right? So there's no way we could use the ERPs of today to do that. I would love to have a system where I could just track a picture of the business every day. And we're able to do it, but it lives in Google Sheets and it comes with its own things, as you know.
Yeah, certainly. And what do you think, if you were to think about just the way that some of these systems are architected today and some of the expectations that sit around different financial reporting frameworks and cadences, where do you feel like some of the greatest resistance comes from? Why don't you think a system like this yet exists?
Yeah, I mean, excellent question, and honestly, one that I would pose back to you because I'm sure you've spent a lot of time
Yeah.
thinking about this, and I'm sure you have your views on this as well. Honestly, for a large part, it's because of the role that we see these financial statements playing in a business, right? If you think about who's the main stakeholder is kind of the primary question, I think. If the main stakeholders are your audit firms, are your investors, people who rely on kind of lagging information, then there's really no imperative to make a change. The existing system works pretty well, right? But if you think about the main stakeholders as the people running the business, then the existing system doesn't work. In an attempt to standardize, which all of this is really important, right? Like we need GAAP, we need auditors, we need all of these stakeholders, but in an attempt to bring some uniformity across the industry, bring high quality, etc., we just make it extremely hard to move quickly, right? And there's no way you can make kind of day-to-day business decisions with this extremely lagging information. So I do think there's a fundamental disconnect in who are we serving, with some of the information that most finance teams produce.
Yeah, completely agree. Completely agree. It's definitely, yeah, the sort of long tail downstream, what are considered the most material outputs in some ways of what happens with your financials. We would agree and see that as the, unfortunately, what sort of leads this general framework of accounting happens on a monthly interval and this monthly cadence. And that's, because that's what you report on, that's how the whole thing is built. And yeah, it's a bit of a travesty in that completely disrespects what would be most operationally helpful for those that are actually, operating the businesses. So very, very much agree there. When you think about, some of the aspects of, you mentioned accruing things daily, for example, some of the aspects of other, operational insights that you would want to be able to look at and say, as of today, X is true. What other aspects of the business do you find would benefit from more of an ongoing or continuous accounting framework?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the leading indicators of the business tend to be like non-financial, right? And I think this is kind of true in most businesses, which is exactly why I think I see the data team as adjacent to the finance and accounting team, but not fully superimposed, right? So in our business, part of why I love this business is it's really actually at the heart of it a simple business. People invest their money with us. The more people that invest and the more that they invest, it leads to better outcomes, not just for them, but also for us, right? So one of the leading indicators is just assets on the platform, AUM. And so that is a metric that's not only like tracked daily within the company, but really it's tracked down to the minute or second, right? Every single user action is captured within our data warehouse and replicated at least daily. So I do think it's really important to separate out kind of leading and lagging indicators. Most financial metrics tend to be lagging indicators, but useful ones. And leading indicators generally, in my experience, live in a data warehouse and then, are surfaced in various ways across the business. And now, in an ideal world, I do think they could live together, right? There's no, like, nothing to say that there is no single system that, could do both. But at the very least, it's faster lagging indicators like revenues, profits, etc. And then ideally also like up to date leading indicators for the business, right? Customers, activity, assets for us, or that the equivalent thereof in other businesses, right?
Yeah, we're talking a lot about this sort of data driven approach. You mentioned now a couple times this concept of building out a data warehouse team, having that be a fundamental backbone of the financial operations at Public. So obviously, you believe very strongly in the importance of marrying the finance operations with data. Talk me through how you do this in practice. Where did you start? If we were to go all the way back to you've just joined Public, you're figuring out how to sort of organize the team. Where did you make certain key hiring decisions? How did you sort of set the guidelines for folks on where data would live? Would love to get more of that story.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I actually think it doesn't begin at Public. It begins in my last role in my line. We had a data warehouse in the company, but it lived completely separately. It lived in engineering, and it was used for a couple of financial metrics, including revenue recognition and provisioning for losses. That was a lending company, and so this is a very specific. I'm sure you're familiar with the term, and honestly, most of your listeners will be. So obviously, like big things on an income statement, right? Like revenue and provision, they're literally the top two line items. But nobody on that team had any idea what it meant to have an audit trail or have data that wasn't immutable, that couldn't be overwritten, changed, etc. Right? And it led to a world of problems through audits, through like just simple month-end reconciliations, even without external stakeholders. And so, out of necessity in that role, I built out a data warehouse within the finance team that ran a bunch of reconciliations, had a clear audit trail, and ensured that the data that we received from engineering and from other parts of the business was structured in a way that we could, maintain a continuous time step of changes, right? A simple thing, but a really important one, as you know. And that experience taught me that, data, this word is thrown around. There's consumer, there's more like product focused data needs, and that can absolutely live in engineering orgs. But really, in order to service the org and service the employees of a population, that data needs to be one, extremely accurate, two, properly reflect the financial performance of the company for it to be useful. And so I found then that, in most like companies of the future, I think these warehouse will live within the finance team. And so when I joined Public, it was part of my conversation on joining, and it was a very easy conversation really to have with our engineering counterparts and with the CEOs, etc. People saw it, and we have a very seamless cooperation with our engineering team, and there's a clear understanding that anything that's product facing, consumer facing, it lives within the engineering org. But really, the main stakeholders for this data warehouse is the company itself, right? And then, as a result of that, auditors, external regulatory agencies, stakeholders like that, right? And so, my first hire at Public was actually someone to build out the data team. We had two part-time accountants, and one of the first things I did was honestly fire them because we needed full-time accountants, many of whom you know well. But even before doing all that, my first hire was a data hire, and I do think tremendously lucky that it was sequenced this way. And I was able to do that because a lot of times when CFOs are walking into organizations, there are existing teams, existing ways to do things. In our case, it was pretty much a blank slate. And so what it allowed, it was the evolution of a data warehouse to be alongside our product as well as our finance team. And so they became really deeply enmeshed with each other. So almost everyone on the finance team knows their way around Looker, knows how to work with specific people on the data team to various information. Our data model is fully up to date with that revenue profit calculations. We can pull extremely detailed views on a per user basis on profitability of a customer, impact on customer service, this, that, or the other. And so the advantage is a lot of employees at Public take it for granted that this operational information, which ties back to financial, lives in a way that with a single source of truth and lives within the company. And I think you probably seen with your experience across different companies that it's a massive unlock when you don't have to argue about definitions or how you calculate something across the company, right? You take for granted that everyone has the same view of key metrics. It really changes the game on what you could spend time on.
Certainly, certainly, and that sort of speaking the same language is true, not just about understanding business metrics and operationally what's happening, also across projects, right? If you're working collaboratively on anything, making sure that you're speaking the same language is so helpful. So, Sruthi, a lot of thoughts here I think are really resonant with how we think about building teams and building culture. I'm curious, when you first came into the role at Public and decided that first hire was going to be someone running point all things data, building out a data warehouse. Any reactions from the team at large that were unique there? Was there anything that anyone pushed back on you as that feels unconventional or not like the right prioritization? Curious what that was like in those first weeks.
Honestly, not really. I feel like Public is a culture where we like to use the acronym DYT, which is do your thing. As I came in as CFO, I'm lucky to work at a place where I had a lot of trust on sequencing a lot of this. In some part, that sequencing really depends on what is most important in the org when you walk in, right? Like every company has a unique setup. We didn't really have burning issues on accounting, even though we did need to build for the long term and we needed full-time staff. Things were generally fine, like the books were getting closed, right? Anything on the strategic finance side, I could build my own models. I could build my own plans. Like I felt like that aligned most directly with my own personal skill set. So it wasn't a burning issue. But I couldn't build out a data warehouse, and I knew we needed one. And so a lot of times when I think about how do you build out a team, I really don't have a playbook. I think the answer usually is how can you tap into the skills of the people around you in the company that you're in, and what really is driving the org priorities, right? In general, I believe in hiring as few people as you can. I think smaller teams work better, and you know that it's more effective, particularly at a startup. And so it's really important to, I think, not go in with preconceived notions in a new role.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so to that end, hiring as few people as you can. What characteristics are you particularly vigilant about when bringing someone onto the team? What feels indispensable in terms of background or disposition versus teachable once someone has joined?
Yeah. It's a tough question to answer generally because I do think that technical expertise is key, especially in a startup, right? We do look for people who've done the specific role before. So if it's an accounting, I think definitely knowledge of GAAP. I would ideally having worked in fintech, ideally understanding a little bit the nuances of a technology companies, SBC, etc. Right? So I do think some technical expertise goes a long way, but really the biggest thing I think is curiosity. Like I love to hear people who come up with creative ways to solve the problems that they run into. A lot of the times in the interviews, especially with the awesome team that we have here now, it just comes through as a story of I ran into this wall and then I did everything I could. I worked with this other person, or I picked up the skill set, or I did this thing on the side and built something new to solve it, right? People who take that level of ownership and use curiosity to guide them in picking up new skills to solve problems. I absolutely love that character trait. And the last thing I'll say is honestly, and this is fitting into the culture of Public, which is that you're confident in your skills, but not an asshole. We're a culture where people speak very directly, but it really is high performing, kind people, I think. And so I do think the cultural fit is extremely important. There's a place for everyone, but for us, and so I rely, I'd say, on Public's cultural principles very heavily when hiring, in addition to the technical skills as well as curiosity mindset.
Excellent. All values that we very much believe and embody on our teams too, and certainly appreciate the sort of inspiration that can have and the inspirational effect that can have on folks feeling like they're charged to do their best work and have the right amount of ownership. And that all sounds great. I'm curious, when you think about just processes that you then split across members of the team, and how you sort of allocate team resources, and what folks are working on, and making sure there's a good balance there. How have you found sort of measuring that sort of what is someone's peak performance? How do you help them get there but not overwhelm them? And just generally that sort of pulse check on how the team is feeling about the work to be done. Any strategies or thoughts that you've come to there?
I think that candidly, startups involve long hours, right? Like everyone is generally pushing a little bit kind of beyond their comfortable, and you don't really opt into a startup environment unless you're okay with being uncomfortable with respect to this. But what I found is, people don't actually want an easy job, especially the ambitious people that we tend to hire here at Public, right? They want to be paid a fair amount for their job. And as an employer, it's on me to assess against the market, make sure people are adequately compensated and they're excited about it, right? But really, people stay to work with the right people around them and move the needle, right? Work on impactful things. And so as long as people are having impact and are excited about the people they work with, I've found that like getting overwhelmed or working too much is honestly not kind of the deciding factor for ambitious people. They don't mind going above and beyond as long as they're picking up new skills, do feel like they're doing it alongside people that they like and are working towards a larger goal. And so I tend to focus a lot of my effort on ensuring that people are working on meaningful things. And of course, like having, a no tolerance culture for people who don't work well with others, right? We make changes quickly, cannot, play within the public cultural landscape. And so I think the biggest thing is really giving people meaningful work versus trying to manage their workload.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I'd love to switch gears here and talk through sort of all things AI, both in terms of how you feel the team is operationalizing different use cases, maybe some of the skepticism or realities on the ground differing from the sort of volume of what we hear out there around what AI can or will or is doing for teams, and maybe start there and just get a sense from you. Where do you feel like the team has leveraged things to the greatest extent possible? Where do you feel like some of the biggest opportunities still exist that haven't quite been figured out? Would love a general pulse check from your end.
Yeah, I think this is again a topic that I'm still learning on, candidly, right? Like it's changing so quickly. So I definitely don't feel like I have all of the answers. But I'll say that we're trying to stay on top of the AI landscape. And I haven't really yet found anything that's like the magic bullet for particularly for the CFO suite. I know there's a lot of focus on our agentic AI, and maybe it will get to the point where we can use it, more broadly. But at this point, I just don't see yet tools that are not incremental. What do I mean by that? I think the equivalent in software development is like the co-pilot moment versus the cursor or windsurf moment. I don't know that I see the cursor moment yet within the finance stack. You don't really see 200 to 300% productivity boosts yet. So, and something that's, I think, like my TLDR at the moment. But if we think about how we use AI, we do integrate AI enabled tools, right? Numeric being one of them. We also have a contract management tool called BRM, which sweeps across kind of receipts all over the organization and checks to see that there are no, charges that are basically contracts that have slipped through an invoicing or procurement process. And I think that as a smart tool, it definitely enables our procurement function. We use a tool called Aleph on the FP&A side, which gives us still a ton of flexibility around modeling in Excel, making changes in modeling like new products, etc., but also integrating deeply with the warehouse that I had mentioned that allows essentially data to stay consistent across multiple sources, right? A lot of our tech stack is AI enabled, but I wouldn't say that anything at this point is, totally AI driven. We don't yet really have, I think, AI agents generating journal entries at this point. Again, that could literally change over the next week. Maybe we find something new, but that hasn't happened yet. I will say that the team uses ChatGPT or other AI tools in every part of their job, literally every part of their job. We had someone on the team use ChatGPT to write a local macro to automate some reconciliations. Like, this is the kind of stuff that I think teams everywhere should be doing all the time, right? Like, enhancing your own work in small ways as much as you can in order to get productivity boosts. And I use ChatGPT all the time, right? It's become basically my default search engine. So we encourage AI adoption, but we are keeping close eye to make sure we know how it's used within the company. At this point, we don't really have it generating journal entries, but it does inform a lot of commentary, flux analysis, variance analysis, things like that, as well as suggestions, on contracts and areas that we should look at, things that, may need a little bit more work.
Absolutely. No, it's all very resonant and very consistent with what we see across the market of lots of incremental improvement, lots of incremental time savings, depending on the volume of where you might be leaning in more or less. If you are writing hundreds of flex analysis explanations, for example, a lot of our tooling has helped folks shave off days in that context, but not in this sort of operational, as you describe it, that sort of windsurf moment of you have a tool that you live in that is sort of augmenting every step of your work. Not something that we've seen yet either. And of course, areas that we're heavily invested in, and we'll be excited as we're rolling out more of our own journal entry automation and subledgering tooling and that sort of thing, fitting squarely in that camp. But I'm curious, where do you see some of the largest volumes of time lost today? If you were to sort of imagine if there were this sort of tool that sat alongside members of your team and was designed to not necessarily replace them, but of course get them to that 200 or 300% or 300x improvement, what does that look like? Where do you see some of the largest sort of volumes of time lost?
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff will actually come in kind of incremental headcount. Like, I think a lot of the time savings will come from, being able to reach a much greater level of sophistication within the team, whether it's from a public readiness standpoint or whether, it's from a control standpoint, being able to do that without incremental headcount. And so I think we could double, triple in size and no further accounting hires if developments continue the way they are. And I feel like a lot of it comes really from the controls perspective. I think that that's where a lot of the gains will come in the future. So right now it tends to be reconciliations, which team has, for example, I gave the example of the macro written by ChatGPT to automate some reconciliation. That's a very basic, okay, this is a repeatable task that I can automate type of reconciliation, right? But as we grow in complexity, as the business changes, as we have more banks, more partners, more products, etc., reconciliation and treasury management is a huge area. And you could absolutely see kind of more agentic use cases within that. And beyond that comes down to controls, right? Like just documenting, maintaining controls across the organization, and ensuring we're capturing fully reviews and pulling from really just becoming kind of this invisible person or force that keeps track of how information and data moves through the organization, which is ultimately what a lot of controls come down to, right? And so I see the biggest opportunities really as on cash reconciliation or reconciliations in treasury management, and then really controls. And so it's the next level things for us that I think it could be helpful with.
Absolutely. Yeah, much of which comes back to this general premise of having a good data warehouse, having all of your financial data in one system, in one place, and being able to action on complete information and full volume of inputs. Excellent. Well, I'd like to switch gears now and kind of zoom further in on the AI situation at Public. You mentioned the recently launched Public Alpha, your AI-driven investment assistant. Talk us through what have some of the sentiments been sort of internally and externally there, and how do you sort of think about the evolution of that in your own product?
Yeah. So we are lucky that we operate in financial services, which has one of the best structured data sets, out there. And so the applications of AI within investing, I'd say are obvious, but a lot of our competitors really haven't gotten around to implementing quite as well as we have. And part of it is because we do have differentiated data sets. For example, if you go on Public and scroll down on the Tesla name, you can ask the questions like, how many cars did Tesla produce over the last quarter? And we'll give you a neat little chart on what they said they would produce and how many they actually did, right? And as even a casual observer of Tesla, you know that the stock moves way more on that one non-financial operating metric than any like revenue or earnings number, right? It is the leading indicator that the street and many investors look for. So we pull a lot of these operating metrics across not just Tesla, but a number of software companies and some of our top stocks, pulling the operating metrics directly from the unstructured data in filings and then feeding it into our data model, which then informs Alpha, the AI-based chat assistant. So a lot of what we're doing is helping users simply make more informed decisions powered by a data model that is more complete than many of our competitors. It includes, for example, also earnings call summaries and transcripts. You can, by the way, listen to earnings calls within the Public app. Again, a very simple thing that should be easily available. That's really not, right? So stitching
Yep.
together data that exists across a number of things allows us to kind of serve our investors better.
Yep. Excellent. Absolutely. And where do you feel like there, if you were to think about some of the other, we're sort of on this theme of data and how do you bring more of the data points into the fold into one place? Obviously, as you're mentioning, you benefit from having highly structured data in the world of finance. Where do you imagine other enriching data sources possibly coming from? If you were to put a sort of experimentation hat on, looking at some of those indicators like number of cars sold for Tesla being an interesting metric that might live inside of that very structured financial data that you're describing. But there might also be indicators that lives elsewhere, not in some of that core of formally or officially published content, for example. Any thoughts you all have had there that where is there more data, where is there more signal to bring into your system?
Yeah. I mean, part of it lives within our user base itself, right? Like sentiment being a big one. And so there's honestly so much information around intent that we do capture, which, becomes a very interesting, which becomes a big part of our data model as well. For example, one of the features that we have within Alpha is a why is it moving indicator. And really, especially if you think about the rise of crypto or meme stock, sometimes these stocks are moving because of retail interest, simply because the others are buying into it. And so sentiment then becomes a really big indicator, right? And one that we can assess even within our user base on Public. So, that's an interesting one. And I think beyond that, it's not so much like, I think it's the marriage of your own intent, of a user's intent, with the universe of investable assets, right? Really bringing advice, like very traditional financial advice, but to a platform and a model that works for really a self-directed investor of today, right? Mobile first, someone who has a thesis and has very strong views on the things that they're interested in and not interested in, and then applying these filters on the universe of investable assets. I can't say too much because it's coming soon, but this is really where we see the evolution of investing in the age of AI, and so more to come on that.
Very cool. Very cool. We will certainly look out for it. Sruthi, I really appreciate the dialogue here. I'd love to sort of close out with going back to some of your earlier career stories and tie a loop on really the sort of motivations. What motivates you today as a CFO? How do you see the office of the CFO changing? And going back to your mentioning the time at Goldman being during the financial crisis, obviously a time of extreme decision-making pressure and uncertainty and confusion. Where do you feel like in whatever current uncertainty might exist in the markets today, might exist in sentiment and how the world is changing, et cetera, what do you consider to ground you the most? Like, where do you find your centering in terms of approach when there is such high degree of uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, Anthony. I think the answer to this question kind of with respect to my job and also Kennedy individually, right? Because you're right that it does have a lot of parallels to that time of life. It certainly seems like we're staring down this abyss, and the range of outcomes can be like just massive, right? We're looking at an environment where we could have 5 interest rate cuts this year or zero. And I think there's very few times in history where that range of outcomes could exist, right? And we're already in May, and that statement still holds. But I'd say from a professional perspective, this is exactly why we need the super responsive financial systems that we talked about, right? Because the beauty of having finance operations that are up to date to the day is that any forecasting based on that is extraordinarily flexible. So we can actually factor in pretty much any single one of these scenarios without too much incremental work, right? Whether, like I said, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 interest rate cuts, right? And so I think that in a world where things are changing all the time and can change to a massive extent, it's up to finance teams and business teams to build extraordinarily flexible infrastructure, and you see that need even more now. But from a personal perspective, I think it's really important to kind of keep your eye on the ball, right? And this is honestly why I love working at startups and why I love working in the world of financial markets, right? Our assumption is that everything changes all the time. And so I think it's a useful skill set to remember that the thing that matters is your most recent data point, right? Like, so keep your eye on how was yesterday, how was last month, and go on to the next thing, right? There's no point in working too hard and getting having crystal ball version of the future. You just got to put your best foot forward every day. And the beauty again of startups as well as the markets is that they both teach you exactly that.
Amen. Totally agree. Tremendous. Well, Sruthi, I really appreciate all the conversation here. One last question from me. Would love to understand if you were. This is a bit of a cliche one, but I always find folks have a different answer every year. They might be asked this question, and so to the extent you're talking to yourself, it's 2008. Everything is crashing. What's the piece of advice that you're giving yourself about looking ahead?
Oh man, I mean, it's a really good question. If I think back to my 2008 version, honestly, and this is extremely cliche, so forgive me for that, but it is really keep the hope, right? It seemed like a doomsday situation. It really seemed like the world was ending, and it didn't. And it actually ended up being a time of incredible learning. I learned so much about the world, and candidly, I think the whole industry did. And so I think that it's keep the hope alive and, look ahead. And at the very least, these are interesting times.
Amazing. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for the time today. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
You've been listening to Incoming Statements, a production of Numeric. To learn how AI and automation are eliminating the manual burdens holding your accounting team back, visit numeric.io. Join us next time to hear from more top accounting voices on the challenges they're facing and where they see the industry heading.